the Leningrad City Council. We chose you because of your last name, by the way. I don't know if you knew that, but we thought it would go over well, and it did, because they so back then wanted to be part of, excuse me. I did that a lot as ambassador, by the way. They so wanted to be identified with our democratic experiment back then, and you brought the house down, so it's great to be here. I'm here because of you, but also Janice and David, thank you for having me here tonight. I was supposed to be on Rachel Maddow, for those of you who watch MSNBC. And so I work for NBC and MSNBC. I've been doing a lot of the impeachment coverage. I spent 10 hours at a TV station today. Just so you know, in the MSNBC world, you can say no to Lawrence and Brian Williams and Chris Hayes. You're not supposed to say no to Rachel Maddow. And they were even like, well, you can be an hour late, no big deal, right? And then I looked at the traffic patterns. No. So tune in tomorrow night, okay? She does do a terrific job in my view, and I'm proud to be on her team. But we could easily just stop now and we can talk about the news. But I am not going to do that. You can watch the news. You can watch us tomorrow night. You can watch us tomorrow morning to talk about current events. And most certainly, I imagine we'll talk about what's going on in the impeachment hearings. But I want to start to take you back further in time and to try to figure out how did we get here with Russia and Ukraine, for that matter. And so I'm going to talk about my book for the next 20 or 30 minutes. And it's a part autobiographical about my story and my history with the Soviet Union and then Russia. But it's also a story about U.S.-Russian relations. And I basically, through the arc of the next 30 or 40 years, next 30, 40 minutes, want to take you through 30 or 40 years to, yeah, I'm not going to speak for 30 or 40 years, don't worry. How did we get here? And I want to start. This crowd, I'm looking around, I probably don't have to explain what the Cold War was to this crowd, right? When I lecture at Stanford, I do, because most Stanford students, they didn't know what it was. For me, it was a really, really scary moment in my life. I grew up in Montana. I became interested in Russian things. You said you were on the debate team, right? So I joined the high school debate team. It was actually from debate that I got interested in the Soviet Union. Actually, our debate topic was tied to something this crowd might know something about, the Jackson-Vanik Amendment to the 1974 Trade Act. And it was from that experience that I showed up at Stanford as a 17-year-old kid in 1981. We had just elected a new president, President Reagan, who today I have a lot of respect for. Back then, I was scared to death of him. I thought he was going to blow up the planet. I honestly did. All this talk of Star Wars and lots of nuclear weapons, and they had 50,000, we had 40,000, or 50,000, 40,000, and it felt like it was a really, really scary time, at least in my life. And so, fall quarter freshman year, I signed up for first-year Russian, animated by a theory about diplomacy that, to this day, I still hold. I had this idea that if we could just get to know these Soviets, that's what we called them back then, just a little bit better, we might be able to reduce tensions between our two societies. That was the idea. And so, most Stanford kids, they go to Florence for their trip abroad, or the quarter abroad, or London, or Paris. I went to the Soviet Union. That is the end of my sophomore year. That's the Bozeman International Airport. International because we flew to Calgary back then. And remember, the President of the United States is calling this place the evil empire. I had never been abroad ever in my life before this trip. My first trip abroad was to Leningrad, Soviet Union. And just imagine that phone call to my mom in Montana for a minute. Hey, Mom, yeah, I want to study abroad. I'm going to go to the evil empire. And remember, my mom back then thought that California was a communist country. She was not thrilled about my choice of schools coming out here with a bunch of hippies and everything. And then 2 years later, I'm off to the evil empire. But bless her heart, she supported me ever since. But remember, it was scary, okay? I want you to remember two historical facts before I get to the content of the book. So then remember the end of the Cold War. This was, I've already talked about, and I traveled with Zev from time to time in this era. This was a fantastic moment in my life. It felt like the Soviet Union was becoming more like us. They were developing democratic ideas. That's why we did these seminars in Leningrad and Moscow. They were developing markets. They wanted to be a part of the West. It was, for me, a magical moment. These two guys had something to do with it. That's Reagan on the right and Gorbachev on the left. I want you to remember these people because they get forgotten in history. These hundreds of thousands of people who are protesting to advance democracy. This is Manege Square. You can see the Kremlin up there on the left. And if you look really, really hard, you can see me. I'm there. I'm going to come back to this slide. Remember that, right? And it just felt like, as my colleague Frank Fukuyama, who teaches at Stanford now, he wrote this very famous article back then. It felt like the end of history because it felt like we were all on the same side, right? Here's Boris Yeltsin speaking to a joint session of Congress. Sometimes I got a little too chummy here. Here's Yeltsin and Clinton together. But remember that era, that it almost seemed like they were going to be part of the West and part of our democratic community of states. It was a pretty glorious time. All right, fast forward to the current era. Dmitry Medvedev here at the Munich Security Conference, the Prime Minister of Russia, he compares our current era to 1962. That's the year of the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? Our president, of course, on Twitter says it's worse than the Cold War. And we could debate this all night. Is it better or worse, Cold War versus what I call the hot peace? I use that phrase hot peace to echo that it's like the Cold War but different. By the way, this makes for a great final exam question for my class. But let me just take a few of these. You tell me if we're better off or worse off. So the good news is that we're not in a quantitative nuclear arms race with the Soviets as we were during the Cold War, when we were building up our nuclear arsenals. That was dangerous. Thankfully, we're down to 1,550 on each side. By the way, you can still blow up the world with 1,500 nuclear weapons, but better than 50,000 on each side. The bad news is that we are in a qualitative arms race today that involved weapons that we didn't have during the Cold War. One of them, for instance, is called the Poseidon. It's a Russian delivery vehicle for delivering a nuclear weapon. It travels hundreds of miles through the ocean and then explodes a nuclear device on East Coast cities and West Coast cities and floods the places where it blows up, killing hundreds of thousands, some think millions of people. That's something we didn't do during the Cold War. We did not target civilians. So better off, worse off, you tell me. Good news, bad news. The ideological struggle, this is the good news, between communism and freedom or communism and capitalism is over. They're still fighting about it, I think, at Berkeley, right? I'm sorry for the Berkeley joke. We will win this Saturday. But most places in the world, we're not having big debates over socialism versus freedom. We won that ideological battle, and that's a good thing. The West won that ideological battle. The bad news in our current era is that Putin actually thinks he's fighting an ideological struggle against what he calls the liberal, decadent West. That's you. He thinks you're the enemy. Your values, your norms, your multilateralism, your democracy, your liberal values, and he believes that he is the last great conservative, orthodox, traditional leader in the world against the decadent liberal West. And initially he fought that battle inside Russia, eliminating his ideological enemies there, and now he is exporting those ideas, investing a lot of money to export those ideas, by the way, through things like Russia Today, Sputnik, and his bots and trolls. And for a long time, he didn't have much success, but today, he's had some real breakthroughs. Viktor Orban in Hungary, Salvini in Italy, some would even say Donald Trump, and at least some people around Donald Trump that have an ideological affinity to Putinism and his worldview. And what's especially troubling to me about this new ideological struggle, it's not just between states, it's actually mostly within states, including our own state, our own country. Are we better off or worse off? You tell me. All right, last one on this, then I'm going to get to the explanation. The good news from in our current era and the bad news of the Cold War was actually, it wasn't a Cold War. I hate that term. It was a hot war. Millions of people died during the Cold War. Millions, including lots of Americans. Places like South Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Angola, Czechoslovakia, Hungary. This was a hot war. Lots of people died. Thankfully, in our current era, we are not fighting proxy wars all over the planet vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. The bad news of our current era, however, is that there's certain methods of this struggle, this confrontation, that are either we thought we got rid of or are new. So one, am I doing that? Should I step back a little bit? All right, I'm loud. I usually don't have a microphone when I speak at Stanford. Annexation. Entire Cold War, we almost had, I would say we had zero. There's a few cases, you might call it that. But we fought World War II in part to get rid of annexation. It was gone for all of the Cold War. 2014, it came back when Putin annexed Crimea. Sanctions. There are more Russians on the U.S. sanctions list today than at any time during the Cold War. You add up all the years of the Cold War, more people on the sanctions list today than ever in that entire history. New method of fighting. And oh, by the way, there are more Americans on the Russian sanctions list than at any time in U.S. Soviet history or U.S. Russian history. I know, I'm on the list. I can't travel to Russia today because of this new fight that we're in. And then finally, sovereignty. Yes, the Soviets tried to influence public opinion around the world, and so did we during the Cold War. But never before in the history of the Cold War did you have the kind and comprehensive intervention in our 2016 election. Now I'm doing something wrong. Not me, because it's still happening. Okay. Should I just speak like this? Okay, all right. Never did we have that. I'm sorry. It's Putin.
Louise, we need you. How do we turn this on?
Can you hear me now? Okay. So, where was I? Okay. About where we're at in terms of fighting. So 2016, that happened. That's never happened before during the Cold War. So are we better off or worse off? You know, we could play this game, but I think we all agree we're not where we thought we were going to be at the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, right? I think we would all agree there's lots of tension in U.S.-Russia relations. So the question I want to answer tonight is just what happened? How did we get here? And if you don't remember any other slide from my talk, this is the one I want you to remember. How did we go from the photo on the left to the photo on the right? And let me tell you, I was at the meeting on the photo on the right. It's a meeting in Los Cabos between Putin and Obama. The meeting was a lot worse than that photo, okay? So what happened here? And that's what I want to just spend the next 15 or 20 minutes to try to explain. The first explanation is a pretty old explanation. In fact, some people would say it goes back to the time of Thucydides. It's an argument about power and the balance of power in the international system. And the argument is it's about states become more powerful or empires become more powerful. Sometimes the countries next to them become not so powerful. And as a result of that, you get clashes, you get war, and sometimes you get a lot of annexation, right? What you're seeing here is a map of European history going for 1,000 years. And so this argument says there's nothing really different or new about Russia today. Russia was weak after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Russia's back, and this is just how great powers interact. Whether it's good or bad is for somebody else to judge. This is just the nature of international politics, especially between great powers. Weak Russia in the early 90s, Russia's back strong today. We should just expect them to act this way. And I want to be clear, power matters in the international system. I'm not dismissing power. To take an extreme example, has anybody here from Tajikistan? Nobody's from Tajikistan, right? And I don't mean to pick on Tajikistan. I used to go there a lot when I worked at the White House. It's a great country. But you're not interested in me giving a lecture about U.S.-Tajikistan relations because Tajikistan doesn't have the power to annex its neighbors, doesn't have the power to prop up dictators like Mr. Assad in Syria, and doesn't have the power to intervene in our elections in 2016, right? Russia has all those powers, so power matters. But I don't think it tells the whole story for two big reasons. One, I can think of some rising powers in the international system that didn't attack their neighbors, that didn't clash with the United States. Japan and Germany are obvious ones. I'm not even convinced, by the way, that it's inevitable that we'll go to war with China. I have a different view. Even Poland today, much more powerful than it was 30 years ago. I'm not worried about them annexing and going to war with their neighbors. But the second one, power doesn't explain everything, right? There are anomalies to this theory. But the second one is more important to me. When I showed up in Moscow as the new U.S. ambassador in January 2012, President Putin's number one foreign policy objective was to create something, and I'm sure most of you have never heard of because it didn't get much attention in our press. But it's called the Eurasia Economic Union. And what he wanted to do is he wanted to bring together all the former Soviet, the countries that became independent after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and unite them in this economic union as kind of a balance against the European Union. When I arrived, he had Belarus and Kazakhstan in the club, and he was focused, I would say was number one foreign policy priority was to bring Ukraine into that Eurasian Economic Union. And here's why. And this is the last question. I apologize for my professorial way of talking. But listen to the question closely, because it has lots of dependent clauses. Tell me something that you bought that was made in Russia, but you purchased here in the United States. Vodka, okay. So vodka is something they export. I recommend the Finnish vodka, by the way. It's a lot better than the Russian vodka, but okay. Some people buy Russian vodka. Anybody else? Caviar, okay. Fish make caviar, not Russians, but yes, they export caviar. Lots of it now is illegal. Be careful what you buy, but okay. Which? Little dolls, okay. That's good. That's good. That's something they do special. Where did you buy them? Hold on. Where did you buy your Matryoshka dolls? Do you remember? See, he wasn't listening. I bought him in Leningrad is what he just said. That doesn't count. That doesn't count. Okay, rocket engines. Did you buy one? Yes? Okay. All right. They do make rocket engines that we use. So that doesn't come up very often in my talks, by the way. But that's one thing they do well. Yes, the proton missile. And what is it, the RD-180, if I'm not mistaken? That's a good rocket, yes, okay. What did you buy, ma'am? Wow. You just stole my thunder on what I was just about to say. That is really interesting to me. Because what I was going to say is that, just so you're sitting in the front, folks, most people just nodded their head. They've never bought anything in Russia. And most Americans have never bought anything in Russia. In fact, most Europeans have never bought anything in Russia. And this may be the first time ever, I've given this talk quite a few times, that somebody has bought a coat made in Russia. So that's interesting to me. We're going to have to talk. that's because Russians generally don't buy things that they can export abroad, right? Most people don't buy Russian coats. They don't buy Russian televisions or cars or phones. But there was one country in 2012 that bought a lot of goods made in Russia, Ukraine. And that's why it was so critical to get Ukraine, all 45 million of those consumers, those people there, into this Eurasian Economic Union. Without Ukraine, it wasn't going to work. And yet, 2 years later, Putin invaded Ukraine, annexed Crimea, guaranteeing, I think, forever that Ukraine's never going to join his club, his Eurasian Economic Union. So that suggests to me that something else was going on here besides power, right? All right, second explanation. I'll speed up a little bit. It's all our fault. We did this. We are responsible for this conflict. This is an argument you'll hear from Vladimir Putin himself. In fact, I've been next to him when he made this argument. And here's his basic narrative. When Russia was weak, we took advantage. We expanded NATO, we bombed Syria, we invaded Iraq, we supported color revolutions in Ukraine in 2004 and Georgia in 2003, and finally Putin just said, I have to push back. Enough is enough. We have to push back on this American imperialism. And I want to be clear, all these events happened. I write about all these events in my book, and every single one of these moments were moments when our relations did become more confrontational. I'm going to leave out, for the purposes of time, all the things that Russia did to make it that way too, but all these things happened. And yet, after every single one of these events, we had a period of cooperation. Started in 2009, obviously, with him, the new president. That's his sixth day in office. It's my fifth day working at the White House. By the way, just because it's been in the news a lot lately about presidential calls, you might notice he has a bunch of briefing papers and talking points in front of him. He's about to call President Medvedev for the first time, and I'm there doing the pre-brief. That's another thing that we did that President Trump doesn't seem to be too interested in. And by the way, he actually read the talking points that we prepared for him. He didn't just blow them off. One other little tidbit, as I'm walking out, we had a lot of Bush folks, this was a transition period. And right as I was going out, one of the people that were in transition with us said, Mr. McFaul, just so you know, in the future, you're not supposed to touch the desk. I don't know if that's true, but if you're in briefing the president, don't touch the desk, okay? But back to the more serious part. Here he is calling President Medvedev to advocate a policy that later became known as the reset. And it was a pretty simple idea. We're not going to cooperate on everything. We most certainly are going to clash about things like democracy versus dictatorship. But in a narrow set of interests, your interests and ours overlap, and we need to try to cooperate in what President Obama loved to call back then win-win outcomes. Okay? And that's the first phone call where he kind of laid down that argument. And I won't belabor this. I don't want to go through too much nostalgia, although whenever I see that guy, I get pretty nostalgic. He was a pretty great president, I think. He was most certainly a great boss. He never tweeted about me. He never threw me under the bus when I was, never. He was 100% behind me. And we got some things done. That's just the only thing you need to know. This was a great day. This was a fantastic day. We're in Prague, 2010. That big document you see there, that's the New START Treaty. By signing that document, we got rid of 30% of the nuclear weapons in the world at the time. That's a good day, yeah. That's like getting something done. And I want to say this, I'd only spent 5 years in government, but it's kind of hard to do anything in government. It's hard to, produce what we call deliverables. That's a big deliverable. That was good for America, good for Russia. And by the way, we also got 71 votes in the U.S. Senate to ratify that treaty. That was also a good day. Doesn't happen that much these days. And that's us celebrating that day, the only day I ever drank in the Oval Office, just for the record. A couple other things we got done. We got put in place the most comprehensive set of sanctions against Iran, multilateral sanctions, That was the predicate for the Iran nuclear deal that we signed with Iran and the other P5+1 countries that I think made America better off and the world better off. We couldn't have done that without the Russians. We developed NDN, something I'm sure most of you have never heard of. When I showed up at the White House, 99% of our supplies, maybe 95, I might have the number wrong, but most of our supplies to our soldiers in Afghanistan went through Pakistan. But we had a new idea. We wanted to take the war against terrorists to Pakistan. But we couldn't do it if all of our supplies were going through Pakistan. So we had this idea, let's work with Russia and other Central Asian countries to develop this northern route. And by the time I left government, well, the time I left the White House, over 50% of our supplies were going through Russia. By the way, I could be wrong, so correct me in questions, but I think it was the first time since World War II that American soldiers were flying through Russian airspace. And that was a great cooperative thing. Some might even say that was a military partnership. Extremely important one night in 2011 when President Obama made the decision to actually go into Pakistan, violate their sovereignty, and kill Osama bin Laden. Could not have done that without NDN. And then, this crowd is too smart, so I don't need to talk about this, but when I'm teaching my students at Stanford, I always like to remind them about non-events. Nobody ever writes any books about non-events, right? Very rarely. But in government, it takes a lot of energy to avoid disasters. And for me, a complete disaster on the horizon was the genocidal ethnic war in Kyrgyzstan that was going to wipe out hundreds of thousands of people and close our military base there that was also supplying and supporting our war effort in Afghanistan. But you didn't read that headline because it didn't happen. Because back then, we were cooperating with the Russians with respect to these so-called color revolutions, and we diffused that crisis before it got to that stage. All right, I'll skip this. Every one of these boxes represents thousands of hours of my life. They probably seem trivial to you. They didn't seem trivial at the time. But the economic story was also moving in the right direction during these cooperative times. And finally, on the societal side, at the peak of the reset, most Russians had a favorable opinion of us, and most Americans had a favorable opinion of Russia. That wasn't ancient history. That wasn't 30 years ago. That was just several years ago. So, there's the American data. And I want to remind you, all of this cooperation that I just described happened after NATO expansion, after the invasion of Iraq, after the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. So you can't blame these events for our current era of confrontation when in between we had this period of cooperation. That doesn't make any sense. That's not logical. That's a C- in my class, okay? That is not a good causal story. That means that there has to be something else added to the story. And that's the final thing I want to mention for just a few minutes. I think this is the real driver of our confrontation, and that is Russian domestic politics. It's a complicated story. I go into it in the book in detail, but let me simplify it tonight and really focus on two events that drove this story. One, the return of Putin to the Kremlin as president in 2012, and two, almost at the same time, massive demonstrations against his regime. So let me just mention those two things, and then we'll get to questions. First, this one, September 24th, 2011. Putin announces, if you can see in the back very loudly, he's just screaming at his party Congress that he's going to run for president again in the spring of 2012. And I want to be honest with you, in the government, and I actually think in academia too, most people didn't look at this as a big event. Putin's the big decision maker, he's the big dog, Medvedev is the puppet, right? So why should there be any change? He's just moving down the street, he's just taking a new office in the Kremlin. And one day I was in to see the president about something else, and I think it was about the Arab Spring, in fact, now that I remember. It was about the Arab Spring. And as people were leaving, he kind of pulled me back and he asked me what I thought about Putin coming back. And I originally kind of gave him the party line, the intelligence estimates. And he looked at me. He likes this phrase. And he looked at me and said, "Come on, man. You don't believe that." And I said, "No, Mr. President, I don't believe that. because with Zev, I'd met Putin in 1991. It's not exactly like we're Facebook friends. Though given what goes on Facebook, maybe he is. Maybe that Natasha always trolling me, that's actually Vladimir. But anyway, I watched this guy for a long time, and I said, no, Mr. President, I think it's going to be different with him as your interlocutor. And over the next 2 years, we learned that up close and personal. He was really different than Dmitry Medvedev. Medvedev was a young lawyer. He thought about the possibility of win-win outcomes. He liked that phrase. He would use that in talking to President Obama. Putin's a zero-sum guy. He thinks if it's +2 for America, it is -2 for Russia. Number 2, remember, Putin, in his formative years, he wasn't taking classes, with McFaul at Stanford University. He was taking classes with the KGB. And in that worldview, and I've gotten to know a lot of these people up close and personal, we are, on a good day, the competitor, and on a bad day, we are the enemy. And that framework is there in the back of his DNA, in the back of his way of thinking about the world. But this third one was most important. Putin believes, he has a hypothesis. He believes that America, the United States, uses covert and overt power to overthrow regimes that we don't like. Yeah, I hear you mumbling. Guess what? Yeah, there's a lot of empirical data to support that hypothesis over the last 70 years. In fact, we sat down with him one day and we debated that. For about 3 hours, we debated it out at his dacha there. We had 3 different kinds of caviar, by the way. You can see the table. He really wanted to impress the new president. This is July 2009. By the way, just another sidebar. Just notice it's not a one-on-one. We have lots of advisors here, including a former ambassador to Russia. And you'll notice here, I don't want to do that. You'll notice I'm there, and I have a paper and a pen, because I'm the note taker. It's a good idea to have a note taker when you're meeting with Putin, but it's especially a good idea to come prepared for these meetings, because he's not there for happy talk. He's there to advance what he believes is Russia's national security interest. And in this meeting, he came loaded for bear to school the new guy about all the mistakes that the Bush administration had made. And he went through them. He just ticked them through. He spoke for 58 minutes before Obama got a word in edgewise. I remember I was timing it for the notes. And he got to Iraq. And he said, by the way, never criticizing President Bush. He has a soft spot for President Bush. Putin's got one of these deep state theories of the world. It's the CIA, it's the Pentagon, presidents come and go. That's most certainly the way he thinks about our current era with President Trump. Bush, no. Bush administration, Cheney, CIA, yes. And he got to Iraq. And he said, you guys just completely messed this up. What a mess you made, not only in Iraq, but in the entire Middle East. And President Obama responded, you're right. By the way, Putin was completely surprised by that. Think about it. He had never heard an American say that. He'd been dealing with President Bush, Condoleezza Rice. Never had anybody said Iraq was a mistake. And he said, well, you probably don't remember, but long before it was popular to be against that war, I was against the war, and it's part of the reason I was elected president. We're not going to do regime change. We're not going to be going around overthrowing regimes. As we walked out to the cars, I could tell Putin was thinking, well, maybe this guy is going to be different, and maybe there's a chance that we can have a different kind of relationship. But then fast forward to 2 years later, there was all kinds of popular, peaceful demonstrations throughout the Arab world, and I want to underscore, we had nothing to do with sparking any of these demonstrations, not in Tunisia, not in Egypt, not in Libya, not in Syria. We were reacting to events that were happening on the ground. And when it got to Libya, even through the use of force. By the way, use of force that Medvedev himself signed up to. I was there in the Kremlin in the meeting when he did. And he said, we were doing the right thing. That was President Medvedev. But Prime Minister Putin back in 2011 and then President Putin in 2012 had a very different view. For him, the Arab Spring was all confirming his hypothesis about American power. there we are, just like we've always been. And then, and I want to remind you, this same year, 2011, December 2011, it happens in Russia. This was sparked from a falsified election, the parliamentary election. We looked at it 5, 6, 7%, no big deal for an election in Russia. But these people had a different idea. And this time around, they had smartphones so they could document the falsification. And then they spun it around on Twitter and VKontakte and Facebook. And they said, let's go and protest this thing. We're tired of Putin stealing our votes. And you get this many people together. They start with saying we want free and fair elections. But you get a couple of 100,000 people together, they start getting, riling each other up. And by the end of it, they were yelling, Russia without Putin. Россия без Путина. And that sounded to Putin like regime change, right? And remember, the last time, I'll skip that and come back to that. The last time you had hundreds of thousands of people on the streets of Moscow, there was regime change, 1991. Remember? I showed you this slide already. So Putin, first he was pissed at these people. He's like, I made you rich. How did you turn on me? By the way, oil and gas prices had a lot to do with making them rich. Putin didn't have much to do with it. But he needed a new argument to mobilize his loyal following and marginalize the protesters. And that's where we came in. We, the United States. He blamed us for those demonstrations, just like he blamed us for what happened in Libya and what happened in Syria. And now he was blaming us for what was happening in his country. And right then, right as this is happening, I land to become the new U.S. ambassador to Moscow. Actually, it was even before, I remember it vividly, it was Martin Luther King weekend. We just moved into this beautiful house, Spaso House. If you pay taxes, thank you for supporting us there. I think the rent was $800,000 a year. Take a tour on the web. It's a beautiful house, and we're just kind of walking around. It's like living in a museum. There's Henry Kissinger there, and Brezhnev, and Reagan, and all these amazing events had been there. And then I turned on the TV. I wanted to get my Russian up to speed, and there was this 22-minute hit job on me. I hadn't even reported for work yet, explaining to the Russian people that Barack Obama had sent me to Russia to orchestrate a revolution against him. Yeah, welcome to Moscow, right? And so I became, and then, they started saying things about this. Navalny, he's a leading opposition figure. They're saying he's my pet project. By the way, Mr. Navalny's daughter now studies at Stanford as a freshman, so you can imagine the conspiracy theories that are going on in Russia today about that. But I became, I became the poster child for this argument against the United States. And when I say poster child, I actually mean literally poster child, okay? This is a calendar they put out with all the months of the year being other opposition figures. Here's some other posters they put out at this time. The one on the left is at a bus stop, and it says, the May 6th political circus is coming to town again. And there I'm listed as the artistic director. Here is, you've heard a lot about fake news and disinformation lately. Well, I experienced it in real time many years ago. This is my face photoshopped on somebody campaigning for Mr. Navalny, who at the time was running in an election for the mayor of Moscow. And then this, you don't need to understand Russian, but I just want you to get a little flavor for what the news was like, almost on a weekly basis.
Источники из внешнеполитического ведомства сообщили прессе, что последним мероприятием посла, скорее всего, станет день 80-летия установления дипломатических отношений.
So he's explaining that I'm being removed because I failed to provoke a revolution. It was a holiday when I was named to be ambassador because I'm an expert in revolutions, and I was being flown in. I did not have a private plane, by the way, don't worry, to organize these people. They're all coming to get their instructions from me to foment this revolution. And just to be clear, I'm also organizing the fascists. There you have it. There's Mr. Navalny. There you go. There's Mr. Nemtsov, who was assassinated, Garry Kasparov, who lives in New York, Shirokova, who lives in Estonia. Half of the leading opposition figures are either dead or in exile, compared to who was there when I was there. All right, you get the flavor for it, right? Now, this next one I don't want you to laugh at, okay? And I'm not going to play it. I'm just going to show you the end of it. This is still funny, right? This one's not. This came out 3 weeks after my arrival in Russia. And, what do you do with that? You get on Twitter and you start arguing with them. Oh, I'm not a pedophile. And then they say, prove it. But this is the disinformation that we were dealing with. I'm just giving you a flavor of it. This is the environment that I was literally living in Russia. And lest you think it's just about me, I want to just show you one more here. It was also about Barack Hussein Obama. This is a famous television show in Russia where Mr. Kisilov is his name, says you might not think at first glance that Barack Obama and the leader of ISIS have anything in common. But if you look harder, and the emphasis was always on his middle name, it turns out that Obama and Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi actually have exactly the same ideological worldview. So no win-wins with that, right? This is why we're in the confrontation we're in. Punctuated, and I'll end on this, last straw was, again, notice the pattern, lots of demonstrators, this time in Ukraine, this time against a Putin protege. We, again, had nothing to do with sparking these protests. 100 people got killed, 106 to be exact, if my memory serves me right. And we tried to defuse it. Vice President Biden actually tried to get the opposition and the Yanukovych government to agree on a peaceful path forward. And we thought we had a deal. February 21st, I remember it vividly. I was down at the Sochi Olympics as part of our delegation there. And we were congratulating ourselves that we had dodged a bullet here. But 10 hours later, Yanukovych showed up in Rostov, Russia, and there was a brief moment of victory that a corrupt dictator had left, but I knew that Putin was coming back, and 24 hours later, that's when he decided to invade Ukraine. And then, 2 years later, he decided, I'm done playing defense. I'm going to go on offense against these folks, us. And that's when he did what he did in 2016. All right, let me end on this. You've been very patient. Good news, bad news. The good news, if you accept my explanation of our current moment, is we are not destined because of history or culture or the balance of power in the international system to be in confrontation with Russia forever. My story is about actors making decisions that brought us there. That's the good news. The bad news is that the one actor that I think is chiefly responsible is Vladimir Putin, and he's just been reelected to another 6-year term, and the guy works out 3 hours a day. He spends his entire morning trying to keep healthy for the long run to stay in power. So I think in the short run, we're going to be in this confrontational place. By the way, and I think tragically, therefore, we have to go back to some of the lessons from the Cold War, contain when we can, cooperate when we can, and maybe a little more dose of just not caring so much about Vladimir Putin. And this strategy is I think almost every senior foreign policy official I know, both present and former, because a lot of formers work with me at Stanford now, from the Trump administration, agrees with this. Every single one of the people that have been testifying in the last 10 days agrees with this is the right strategy moving forward. There's just one guy in the United States government that disagrees that this is the strategy that we should have. And he just happens to be the President of the United States. And that drama, that tension between President Trump and his government, at least for the next year, that will define, I think, what happens in terms of U.S.-Russia relations. I dig deeply into that story in the ending of my book, but to read about that, you'll have to buy the book. Thank you so much. Thanks for listening.
Take a breath, have a glass of water.
Thank you.
Mr. Ambassador, we're privileged to have you here. And everyone in this room has sent me questions to ask you, so we'll be here till Thursday.
Okay.
I want to start with something very topical, very timely, and very general. We're going to miss Rachel Maddow tonight, so I'm going to ask you the question she's going to ask you. One of the responses, I won't say defenses, but responses to the impeachment hearings, on one side of the ideological spectrum says it's just boring. The other side says it's irrelevant, it's not important. Mr. Ambassador, why should we care? Why is this important moment for our country?
So I'm not an expert on the Constitution. I have my views, but I want to be clear about what I feel like I'm an expert about and what I'm not. But I do teach a course called Democracy Development and the Rule of Law all around the world. And thank you. There's a pretty standard definition in my world, I'm a political scientist, of what is corruption. Corruption, generically speaking, is the use of a public office for private gain. It's really that simple. That's what I think happened here. I think the facts, the evidence is overwhelming. And I think the evidence is overwhelming is in part underscored by how the other side can't actually do anything with the facts, so they have to attack the messengers, right? And in ways that I find deeply troubling. I know most of these people. I served with Lieutenant Colonel Vindman in Moscow. I've known Bill Taylor and Masha Yovanovitch for 25, 30 years. Masha served in the State Department when I was ambassador. These are honorable people trying to do the right thing, and they saw what we've now all seen, and that's just wrong. And we cannot allow anybody to do that, let alone the President of the United States. And I want to be clear, there's something called the Hatch Act. I remember when I showed up to work at the White House, and we had our discussion about you can't even use your email at the NSC for any electoral political activity. I can't use my Stanford email to do anything. I can't send a political candidate money using my Stanford email. I have to use a private email. So just think about that. That's a private institution. Those are our rules. And yet the President of the United States was using his office to leverage and coerce and pressure the brand new Zelensky government to try to help him win re-election. That's wrong. Whether it's impeachable or not, there's some people more expert than I am here. It seems really egregious, but most certainly it's wrong, and then therefore it is proper, and I really do applaud the way Congressman Schiff, a Stanford guy, by the way, has conducted these proceedings. And this notion, a good friend of mine, actually, I don't want to name him in case he's your relative, so I'll keep it to myself, but works for Reuters. He said the first hearing, oh my goodness, it was so boring. And I wrote back on Twitter and I said on TV, first of all, I find it exhilarating because I'm really interested in democracy and the democratic process, and this was it in action. And number two, I'm tired of the damn circus, okay? The circus is what got us here. And people like our press, and they're friends of mine. I'm sorry to get upset about this, but this is exactly what they did in 2016. They chased the circus, and that, they ignored the facts on October 7th, 2016, when an intelligence report came out about what the Russians did. They ignored it because they were chasing the circus. And I like to say, make America normal again. I'm ready for some boredom.
I want to take a moment and focus on Putin's policies and the president's policies. Let's begin with Putin. You've talked to us about the history and how it came to this moment. What's your vision of Putin's long game? Where is he going? What is he trying to accomplish? And how is he trying to do it?
Well, so he has multiple objectives, right? One is he has spent a lot of his time over the last 20 years enriching himself and enriching his friends. And that's pretty well documented. We can put it in more formalistic terms in academia. He has redistributed property rights. How about that? And to be fair, the way property rights were distributed in the 1990s was not fair. And that was a big mistake. that they made during that period. And that made it easier for him to redistribute that property. But what he's done is he's taken it from the oligarchs, as they were called in the 1990s, and he's handed them over to his intelligence officer, his KGB cronies. In fact, Zev, just because I'm seeing you here and remembering, Putin was our main host because he was the deputy chairman for international contacts back then when you and I were there in 1991. But he had a young deputy at the time who was the main guy that I worked with to decide whether we're going to have, chicken or beef at the various seminars. And by the way, it wasn't so easy to find beef in the Soviet Union in 1991, so it was a bit of a challenge. Maybe we didn't have any beef now that I think about it. But he was a guy named Igor Sechin. And I kind of kept in touch with Igor for a while. Igor today has been, the aide to Putin for 3 decades, and now he is the CEO of the largest oil company in Russia. And that's because of this redistribution of property. So that's the first thing he's done. The second thing he's done, and this, I can't quite tell if he believes it or if he doesn't, but at least he says that he is trying to restore Russia as a great power in the international system. And he has got a lot of chip on his shoulders, right? He's a guy carrying a lot of chips. He once called the Soviet Union's collapse the greatest tragedy in the history of the 20th century. And we all know what, other tragedies there were in the 20th century. For him to say that about the 20th century, pretty audacious thing he said, but that's in the back of his mind. So he wants a place where Russia's respected in the international system. And by the way, I'm not against that. I just don't think his strategy is winning them any respect. I think a different strategy would have made them more powerful and more respected. Then there's the third thing about political power. And here I'm going to speculate. But the Putin I saw and the Putin I read about today, I think he's tired of his job. He's worn out with all the various people coming to see him. He hasn't had a lot of success on the economic things he wanted to do. I think he wouldn't mind retiring, but I don't think he can retire. And part of the reason he can't retire is that story I just told you about Igor Sechin. Igor Sechin is CEO of Rosneft for the sole reason that property was stolen from a guy named McFaul. They put him in jail for 10 years, and his company was worth $40 billion when they appropriated it. And Igor Sechin now has the lion's share of it. He can't protect his property rights in a court of law. He protects his property rights through his relationship with Putin. And the group around him, it's all the same way. So they can't afford for Putin to step down. And so I think he, whether he wants to or not, will have to be in power in Russia until either he dies or he's no longer capable of ruling Russia.
Let's turn for a moment to the president. When the president was running, he made the case that a closer relationship with Russia would be good for America.
Right.
And then there have been a series of policy decisions, which some people support, some object to, but they seem to be in the interests of, or corresponding to Putin's interests. The removal of troops from Syria, the delay in the aid to Ukraine, the deteriorating relationship with our allies in NATO. Does the president have a Russia policy, and what is it?
I'm also not Facebook friends with President Trump, but it's a great question, and it's a complicated question. But here's the way I'd simplify it. The Trump administration has one policy, and President Trump individually, as we've been seeing in one case, but it's just one case of many we've been seeing in the impeachment hearings, has another one. And that is the tension there. So let's go through some of the things that have changed versus some of the things that haven't changed. So after Putin invaded Ukraine, I had left the government, by the way, by that time. Putin did not invade Ukraine on my watch. He did it literally the day I flew home to San Francisco. Literally the day I flew out of Moscow, he invaded Ukraine. But what was our response to that? I was still quite involved with the government. I was still being asked to do other jobs, in fact, a Pentagon job. at the time. I ended up not doing it, but I was involved. And three big things that the President Obama and our allies in Europe did. Sanction Russians involved in that, strengthen NATO, and support Ukraine, and economically, militarily, and politically. And I would say on all three of those new policies from 2014, the Trump administration has moved forward in a positive way on all three of those. And in one dimension, I have given them credit. They did support lethal assistance to Ukraine in a way that President Obama did not. And I publicly applauded that, the Trump administration. President Trump doesn't agree with any of those, as far as I can tell. He wants to lift sanctions. He wants better business deals with Russia. He doesn't believe, we've heard it. I'm not going to repeat those words, especially here, that Ambassador Sondland said about what the president thinks about Ukraine. But, we have it on pretty good authority. By the way, the one who reported is David Holmes, somebody who used to work with me in Moscow as well. He doesn't care about Ukraine, and he doesn't care about NATO, right? So you've had this tension for a long time that the president wants to do things that his advisors don't want to do. And gradually he's been rotating them out, by the way, folks. Have you noticed? Two of them work with me at the Hoover Institution now, Secretary Mattis and H.R. McMaster. Their views on Russia are much closer to mine than they are to President Trump. And that is the tension that you see. And then sometimes he just says, I'm doing it myself, as you rightly pointed out in Syria, against the wishes of Secretary Mattis, against the wishes of his point person on Syria, Brett McGurk, special advisor, and he just does these things. And my prediction is if he's reelected, then he's just going to go crazy. Because then he's going to say, I've got the second mandate from the American people. I can do this job by myself. He said that many, many times. He doesn't believe he needs advisors. He can just do this all by himself. And then I really worry, including, first and foremost, I worry about our alliances. I think our alliances could be in real trouble if he gets a second mandate.
Is there a pattern to his thinking about Putin and Russia? Is there a policy there? You advanced a policy which you called the reset, which talked about engagement. You've suggested to us that under the circumstances now, we have to have a hybrid policy of containment and engagement and isolation. Yeah. Does the president have a vision of what we need to do with and about Russia? Or is this just spontaneous kinds of decisions coming as crises and events present themselves?
So I'm trying to be generous here. He has a couple of core intuitions or instincts. And one of them is to pull back and to disengage. And I think that goes back, that's an idea he's had, that isolationist tendencies. And so with respect to Syria, for instance, I can see how that fits that worldview. And I just want to be clear, I think that is really, really dangerous. And this is not a Democrat or Republican thing to be said. I just think that will not serve American national security interests well. That will come back to haunt us. But that there's a pattern of that, and there's a tradition, in American foreign policy going back before World War II, where you can say, okay, Trump fits with isolationists. So to be fair, that's number one. And number two, I would say, so there, in my world, there's the isolationists and engagement. That's one dimension. And by the way, it does not fit neatly into Democrat and Republican parties. We have isolationists in the Republican Party. We have isolationists in the Democratic Party. Same with engagement. And then there's another dimension in my world. We use these terms, they're not very good terms, realists and liberals, or realists, and if you're in the Republican Party, neocons. Realists basically don't care about values. They don't care about human rights. That's the first argument I made in my remarks, right? It's just about power and accept the world as it is and don't care about those things. Wilsonian liberals, not liberals in the liberal conservative vein, but Wilsonian liberals, sometimes called neoconservatives, although nobody uses that term anymore, they believe that America has a role greater than just interests and balance of power, that we believe in things, and we should support those that believe in the same things that we believe in, and first and foremost about democracy and human rights. On that dimension, he's a hardcore realist. He could care less about human rights and democracy anywhere, as far as I can see and as far as I've been told by people that work with him. So that's the rational part. Then there's the irrational part. And it's just a kind of wrong, simplified, naive, I'm trying to find a more generous word, theory of diplomacy. But I really believe he thinks this when it comes to Putin, and I see it in evidence in other countries as well. He believes that the goal of his policy towards Russia is to have a quote-unquote good relationship with Putin. That's what he's trying to do. And if you listen to him talk, that's what he says his goal is. Wouldn't it be great if we could all get along, right? And I want to be clear, I am not against diplomacy. I'm not against engagement. Even people like Kim Jong-un. If, and this is the if that is important to diplomacy versus just winging it, if it leads to tangible outcomes that advance the interests of you, of the American people, of your security, your prosperity, and your values. And what he gets wrong is that the means to that is sometimes engagement, sometimes it's coercion, sometimes it's war, by the way, right? That's your toolkit, engagement or war on the spectrum. He thinks that's the objective of a policy. And so far, I would argue that he has not achieved one concrete thing. All of his happy talk with Putin, all his fealty towards Putin, you want to investigate McFaul? Let me hand him over. That's what he did in Helsinki. All of this, appeasement, I think is the right word, to Putin. And I ask, has that made us more secure? Has that made us richer? Has that made us truer to our values? I literally can't think of one single thing that we have achieved from that. And so that's the part that he just fundamentally doesn't understand the nature of diplomacy.
I'm glad he didn't hand you over. That would have been a
Me too, and so my family's grateful for that too.
much shorter evening. Talk to us about alliances. I grew up, as you did, with this post-war notion of America at the center of a circle of Western alliances that protected this country, protected our prosperity, protected our security. It seems to be that the president doesn't see alliances in the same way. And the question is, first of all, how does he see those alliances? And second of all, how has his policy toward those alliances changed our national security?
Well, I think you're right. I think he has a kind of theory of alliances as like protection rackets, right? You pay up and we protect. That is not the way I understand alliances, and that most certainly has not been the way we have thought about alliances, since the end of World War II. And I think it's really dangerous. Just first, some basic facts. Let's talk about NATO for a minute. The only time that Article 5 in NATO has been invoked is when we were attacked, not when all those people that we're allegedly protecting were attacked. And when we were attacked, Europeans, other countries as well, but our NATO allies went to war with us in Afghanistan, and their soldiers died next to our soldiers fighting in Afghanistan. That's not a protection racket. That's an alliance. They did that with us because they valued that relationship, right? And per capita, some of them lost a lot more soldiers than we did in the fight in Afghanistan, and they were there because we were attacked, they weren't attacked. Second, if I look out over the horizon, I see real challenges from powerful autocratic states. China, Russia, and Iran are the top three, but there are many more. We are in a moment of democratic erosion around the world and the rise of these autocratic powers. And if we are going to meet the challenges of China and Russia and Iran, we need our democratic allies. It has to be more than just a protection racket. Because I do believe that this is a normative struggle, not just one about power. And then just third, very simplistically, because the big game's on my mind. Diplomacy is a team sport. War is a team sport. why would you want to go alone when you could go in with allies on your side? I just it's pretty simple, folks. Like, we're better off with more people on our team than less people. And I would hope that, and obviously that argument's not working with the president. I hope that it'll work with either his second term or a next president.
There's an area of the world, of course, that has a special relationship to our community. Help us understand Russia's intentions in the Middle East, and help us understand how Russia, Syria, Iran, the Gulf states, Israel, Saudi Arabia, help us understand this mess, would you please?
How much time do we got?
Much as you need.
Well, first, before we get to the Middle East, I want to just say, I was saying it earlier to some of you, I actually got my start as a political activist taking letters to Jewish refuseniks in the Soviet Union. And it was part of those experiences. I told the story again, so I apologize for those already told it, but I remember vividly one day with two other Americans, we handed this young high school student a letter of acceptance from the London School of Economics. And it was this joyous moment. It was in Leningrad. And then the joy tapered off because he didn't have an exit visa, and it was very uncertain whether he could ever go. He finally did get to go, but that's when what autocracy and totalitarianism, those had been kind of abstract concepts for me. I was kind of a leftist kid at Stanford, and that's when I felt it. You know, it's one thing when you think about it abstractly. It's another thing when you see it and you feel it. So that community meant a lot to me, and I was very involved with that community for 30 years of my life. Had some fantastic experiences as the U.S. ambassador. By the way, if you ever get the chance to be the U.S. ambassador anywhere, but especially Russia, do it. It's an awesome job. We've been talking too many serious things here. I just want to remind you, it was fantastic to represent our country in all the different communities in Russia, and I always like to remind people, this crowd doesn't need to be reminded as much as other places I talk, but Russia is not a monolithic place. That is a highly complex society, and Putin is just one person. And it is a really rich society with rich people and poor people, with lots of different ethnicities, lots of different religious faiths, and a really rich cultural place. I just love living there. I love being the U.S. ambassador, and I miss it because I'm on the sanctions list. All right, Middle East. Putin has a short game and a long game. His short game is to be the Kissinger of the Middle East, to be the guy making deals between everybody. And his cards are smaller than the ones that Henry ever had, but he's playing them more aggressively than Mr. Kissinger ever played them. So he wants to be the deal maker with everybody. So think about who has pretty good relations, pretty good, right, with the following people: Iran, Syria, Turkey, Israel, and now Saudi Arabia. One country, Russia. And he's been cultivating those relationships for a long, long time. In a way, I'm no fan of Putin, as you know, and he's no fan of mine, but it's been pretty sophisticated to manage all of those different kinds of relationships. And in doing so, his first objective is to push us out. So you rightly described when President Trump decided to pull off the border there. Who wins from that? First and foremost, Vladimir Putin. More so than the Turks, by the way, because the Turks are going to have a mess there. They're going to have a mess there. They're going to be fighting in and out with the Kurds, and that's going to create more opportunities for Vladimir Putin to be the peacemaker, right? To come in and work it out with them. So that's his short-term goal, and I think he's achieved some successes. In the long term, and here I'm talking about 20 or 30 years out, I think there'll be a pretty big shift in terms of Russia's relations with the region. He's already started it, but I think it'll speed up, especially if there's a revolution in Iran, which I put at like a 50% probability in the next 10 years. That is, I mean, there's lots happening today, but will this regime last another 10 years? I at least 50% odds says it won't. And if there is a breakthrough there, and if there was a democratic breakthrough there, that country would radically shift towards us. I've been to Iran. I'm banned from 2 countries now. I'm banned from Iran and I'm banned from Russia. I still have my Chinese visa. I'm still hoping I won't get banned from there. But that would be a tectonic shift, and he's concerned about that. Formally, Iranian-Russian relations, they're allies. You dig under it, they're not very close. And I think that would clash. And so he's been cultivating the Sunni countries in the region, and you just saw it. He's been to Saudi Arabia, and I think if there's a shift when Iran, he moves that way, and then he's put a big bet on Israel. He has very smartly, from a diplomatic point of view, cultivated Bibi, and I think in the long run, he thinks that Israel could be a strategic partner of Russia, especially in the event if we withdraw.
I want to recommend the ambassador's book, From Cold War to Hot Peace. And I want to recommend, if you read it, this is how I read it. I read the first chapter to find out who you are. And then I read the last chapter, which gave me a terrific context to the things we're watching on TV these days. And then I went back and read the middle to try to figure out how the heck did we get here? And it's informative. It's very readable. It's actually more than readable. It's like stay up late at night readable. That's how good it is. So I want to ask you a couple of questions about what you wrote, and in particular a comment that you made almost at the very end of the book. Controversial, I know, but I need to ask you this. Page 443.
Wow, he did read the book.
Did Vladimir Putin make Trump president? You said, of course not. The American people did. You still believe that? And if you do, tell me what he's going to do in the next election.
Yeah. So first, I want to tell you, there's some dense chapters in the book, and I give you permission to skip like the arms control ones and just go to the ambassadorial chapters, right? You can read, I wrote it deliberately that way that you can skip around. So you read it exactly the way it was intended. Yeah. Number two, so let me back up to the 2016, and I have been very involved with this, both in commentary, but we have a big team at Stanford that has studied this very closely. We have a 140-page report on our website of the 45 recommendations that the United States government should do to protect us in 2020. And by our count, we've done 0 of them so far. That's just the way I write about it here, but if you really want to do deep dives, go to my website and the Freeman Spogli Institute at Stanford. Here's why I wrote that phrase. Putin, as I said in the talk, obviously, massive comprehensive campaign to do 2 things: to help Trump win, and of course to help Secretary Clinton, my former boss, lose, and also to exacerbate tensions in our society. So they did both of those things, and they did them, I think, radically successfully. And the thing that was most successful, and in fact, not to keep advertising other work, but we just published a piece, now that I think about it, in the Washington Post earlier this week with my colleagues at Stanford about this. The most successful thing they did was they stole the DNC's emails and John Podesta's emails, and they published them. But then they did something that hasn't gotten enough attention, and that's what we wrote our piece about. They nurtured this narrative in our media. And our media, instead of saying, we're going to ignore that because we don't like the source, they went along with it. And Clinton's emails, Clinton's emails, Clinton's emails. There's a lot of academic data now that shows that theme, Clinton's emails, was not just on Fox, folks. It was on all of the national networks. And it dominated the way that people thought about that her candidacy. That was the Russians. And we write about how they do this, right? So sometimes it's fake news, sometimes it's real stuff, but a lot of it has to do with our media picking it up and amplifying it. But here's my bottom line on 2016. They did that. They did the troll stuff, as we all know. They trolled me, by the way. I'm in the Mueller report. I was interacting with somebody from the Internet Research Agency. I didn't know it at the time, but I was. And here's where I come down with my social science hat. We do not have the data to show the independent causal impact of what the Russians did versus what all the other factors in that election did. And I, as a, truth matters at Stanford University every day, not just on Mondays and Wednesdays, and facts matter and evidence matter, and we have run this to the ground with people that are way more sophisticated about American elections than I am, and we can't isolate that causal part, right? So that's why I wrote the sentence I did. But what I would say as opinion and speculation is that this election was won in the margins, 78,000 votes. Let me rephrase it. Putin had an effect in the margins, and this election was won in the margins, 78,000 votes in 3 states. I can't prove that, and nobody can prove that because we weren't looking for it. At least this time, by the way, social scientists will be looking for it, so we'll know it after the fact. What will they do in the future? I think they're going to be mostly focused on this narrative stuff. I'll be surprised if they steal data again. And let's not call it steal data. Let's call it stealing property. This is a violation of our sovereignty, folks. This is not just some, I hate the verb hacking. It makes it sound like it's just some kind of off to the side thing. They stole property from these people for political purposes. I'll be surprised if they do that again. But I think the narrative part they're going to be completely engaged in, and I just want to underscore, we've done nothing to protect ourselves any better in 2020 than we did in 2016.
I want to finish by asking you to be a prophet. First of all, you've predicted
Prophet.
Saturday's game, so Stanford, are you taking points, or are you just going to give us a straight bet?
We've had a tough year. I don't want to take any points.
Yeah, it's not a good year to bet on Stanford. You and I grew up during a Cold War, and when we were kids, it would have been impossible to conceive of what you got to see in 1991 in Russia. The democratization, the fervor for democracy. So it's always hard to say, what tomorrow's going to bring. At the end of the book, you present us with a kind of a scenario. You say, what do you think's more likely? That Vladimir Putin's going to live another 50 years, or that Russia's going to become democratized in the next 50 years? So I want to ask you that plus one more question, which is, given those two possibilities, and then how's the world going to look in 50? How your children and my children, the world they grew up in, how will it be different if Russia democratizes? And how will it be if Putin and his cohorts remain in power in Russia?
Right. That's a great question to end on, but it's a hard question to end on. I'm going to try to do it in 2 different ways. I'm going to sound like a political scientist, and I'm going to sound like an ambassador, okay? So both my hats. As a social scientist, there's a theory called modernization theory. Marty Lipset was the first one to write about it back in 1959. And it's been studied many times for decades ever since. And to oversimplify, it's the more well-to-do a society is, the more likely they are to consolidate democracy, right? Not necessarily become democratic. The breakthrough part we're not very good at predicting. But on average, over hundreds of years, this theory is pretty robust. If you look at the richest 20 countries in the world in terms of GDP per capita, and you take out the oil exporters, because that's distorting, 19 of them are democracies today. There's only one country on that list that's not, Singapore. Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? And we have some theories about why. It's like, well, people become rich, they then purchase things, and then they don't want the government stealing their property, and then they don't want the government taxing their property. Remember that phrase, no taxation without representation, right? Well, that's kind of the basis of this theory, right? And then people move into cities, they become more educated, they become organized. That's kind of modernization theory. It's not good at point predictions, but it's good at looking at things over long time spans like you just suggested. And by those metrics, Russia is one of the richest countries in the world that is not democratic today. Russia and Kazakhstan, by the way, I think are the two. China's got 50 years to go before they even get to the threshold, by the way, just so you understand this. China's a big economy, but GDP per capita, they're still a middle-income country. They're still at 10,000. They're nowhere near the threshold where you break through. Russia's already there. And so that suggests to me that Putin came along and he got in the way of that. And in fact, it's a really contingent story. The plan back in 1997 was for another guy to be chosen as Yeltsin's successor, a guy named Boris Nemtsov. He was the one that was picked. And this guy, he was an incredible person. If I don't want to go on too long, but just a little bit of inspiration from Boris. He was a young governor in Nizhny Novgorod, elected twice during the economic depression, Jewish, and one of the most charismatic leaders that Russia has ever had. So when you hear that the liberals can never be popular in Russia, I want you to just remind yourself of what I just told you about Boris Nemtsov. Real incredible person, assassinated in 2015, 400 meters from the Kremlin wall. I tell you that story because I think Putin is an accidental, and I write about it in the book. He's accidental. He just gets picked out of nowhere. The Russian people didn't demand Putin. He was put in place to protect the property rights that I was talking about. And then oil prices and gas prices rose. That's how he took over. So I just think in the long run, it's unlikely. He hasn't created a party. He hasn't done any of the things to institutionalize his autocracy. I think it becomes pretty dicey after the end of the Putin era. And let me predict one thing. I do predict that Putin will not rule Russia forever. How about that? I'm going to go out on a limb. So that's the social science theory. But let me end. And if all that happens, I want to get your second question in before I end on the anecdote. If all that happens, of course, we'll have closer relations with Russia. We're going to have differences, but I really think this ideological dimension is what's at play here. Here's the anecdote that I'll end on. Like I said, being ambassador is a great job. You were required to sit in the front row of the Bolshoi Theater and go to the Nutcracker on New Year's Day and then stand up, where you guys are sitting right there, stand up and wave and people would cheer. Because there's a lot of people in Russia that love America and love Americans. Never, ever forget that, despite everything you hear. It was fantastic to have, I used to be a jazz musician, and one day in my house, in front of my 500 closest friends, I had a room in my house that could seat 500, Herbie Hancock played. Yeah. And by the way, music is one of those just magical things that just breaks down the differences between Russians and Americans. Some of the most special events I had as ambassador was with music involved. My father's a musician, and it was great. So again, if you ever get a chance to be an ambassador, do it. One of the things that was in my portfolio was nurturing relationships between high-tech firms, because I'm from the Valley, and I had a special interest in that. So I would go and meet, I would go to companies and just chat about what they're doing. And I remember one day I went to I won't name it, but a Russian company, high-tech company. There's probably 100 to 130 people in the room. And by the way, just to remind you that we're not as different as Putin wants you to make you think we are, the place looked exactly like somewhere in Palo Alto. Beanbag chairs, free food, people in their jeans, 90% male, engineers, right? So I thought, this is a place I know well. And so we're just chatting. This is all in Russian, off the record, informal. And at one point, there had been this demonstration. I showed you a poster of it, the May 6, 2012 demonstration. I asked how many people had been there, and they all raised their hands. That was jarring to me. That was interesting. But as the academic, I'm thinking, oh, this is Marty Lipset, right? People more well-to-do a society. These are the rich urban people. They have things that they own. They don't want to live in an autocracy. And later in the conversation, there was another demonstration coming up. And I asked how many people are going to that. And I want to remind you, I forgot to tell you this, in May 6th there was violence and people got arrested. Lots of people went to jail. This time when I asked, only 3 people raised their hands. So I just moved on. I didn't want to dwell on it. And about 10 minutes later, a young woman, I would say, kind of mid-30s, maybe late 20s, she raised her hand in the back, and I'm just paraphrasing, obviously, but she said, Mr. Ambassador, I think you read the room wrong. I didn't raise my hand. I can't afford to be arrested. And then she mumbled something about her no-good-for-nothing husband. She said, if I got arrested, who's going to take care of my kids? I'm the breadwinner in the family, right? She's an engineer. I can't afford to go to jail right now. But don't think for a minute that I've changed my views about Putin. And I think about that a lot because we don't have very good data about what Russians actually think, because all the polling companies are controlled by the government, and all the cell phones and all phones for that matter are listened into by people. There's only, if you're in Vladivostok and Volodya from Moscow calls you and says, hey Natasha, what do you think of Vladimir Putin? There's only one rational answer to that question, right? I love the guy. But that story reminded me that we're not very good at predicting revolutions. We're not very good at predicting these democratic breakthroughs. But I think there's a lot more willingness in that society, political preferences than we see. And I think we might be surprised when the Putin era ends how quickly this place could become a democratic, European, normal, boring country. And that's a country I want to be. Maybe then I'll get a visa to go back.
I'd like to thank Ambassador Michael McFaul.
Thank you.
He will be in the hallway signing books if you'd like to buy a few.
Can you join me in thanking Rabbi Feinstein for representing us so well? And thank you. Stay tuned for our next program on voter suppression. We'll be in touch with you all. The program will be in January. Good evening.